3 months ago today, a 22-year-old woman, Ms. Mahsa Jina Amini, was killed at the hands of Iran's so-called morality police. Astonishingly, against the savage brutality of this regime, brave Iranian women and men have continued their protests since.
And the Iranians, that expression of dissent is the most important cultural transformation, I believe, that has happened since the 1979 revolution. And I do believe that it's in genealogy, it goes back to that 1979 revolution. That once a nation, once a subject asserts itself and demands to be recognized and demands respect, then it's very, very hard to push that subject back into a box and say that, no, you do what I tell you to do. In the late 1960s, 1970s in Iran, if you ask any primary school kid, what happened to Mossadegh, they would say that the CIA toppled Mossadegh. But it left a very, very deep mark on Iranian psyche that denied the Shah's monarchy legitimacy. And that stain remained with the Shah. Khomeini was extremely marginal in the Iranian seminaries. He was not a well-respected jurist or theologian, and the great majority of significant ayatollahs, or what they call the sources of emulation, despised Khomeini. When the students took over American embassy, they wanted to show that they are as anti-imperialist as anybody in the political landscape in Iran. And many of these students, I knew them. At the time, I was a student at the Polytechnic University in Tehran, and most of the members of the leadership of that students who took over the embassy came from Polytechnic University. So I knew them pretty well. This is the interesting part. Not only didn't Iranian people had no idea when they were voting Islamic Republic, the leaders themselves didn't have any idea.
What do you mean by that?
Khomeini didn't have any idea what exactly was an Islamic Republic.
Did you know that Mr. Khomeini's slogan for Iran was independence, freedom, and Islamic rule? But after he was exiled to Paris and was the subject of scrutiny by Western media, he changed his slogan from Islamic rule to an Islamic Republic. The trouble was then, as it continues to be now, that in a republic, the source of legitimacy is the people, but in Islam, the source of legitimacy is the divine. So how can this dichotomy be reconciled? That question has created conflicts in post-revolutionary Iran from the very beginning. For example, immediately after the 1979 revolution, members of Iran's clergy had no idea how to go about writing an Islamic constitution for a republic. Hey there, news peelers. Today is December 16, 2022, and this is Adele, the host of the History Behind News podcast. Once a week, I have the pleasure of speaking with distinguished professors and critically acclaimed authors from around the world who help us better understand our news and current events by providing some perspective from our past. We call this Peeling the History Behind News, the histories of many countries we read, watch, and hear about in our news media. For example, whole series on Ukraine's, Iran's, Russia's, and China's histories. And of course, several series on the U.S. economy, culture, politics, environment, science, and much more. I'm committed to making in-depth history that are researched and written by scholars enjoyable and accessible to everyone. So grab a cup of coffee or your favorite drink and let's get into it. According to The Guardian, a British daily newspaper, just this past week, Ayatollah Khomeini's own sister, whose daughter was arrested last month in Iran, spoke against her brother's rule, calling it a despotic caliphate. In addition, Iran's former president, Mr. Mohammad Khatami, recently supported the protests. In the context of Iranian politics, Mr. Khatami is considered a moderate. Although Iran's regime has used brute force, viciousness, and violence in the last 3 months to suppress the protests, it is also desperately trying to show some semblance of moderation. For example, it recently abolished the morality police, but that has really impressed no one. Interestingly, Iran's government has also attempted to appeal to high-ranking moderates. For example, it secretly reached out to the families of Ayatollahs Khomeini and Rafsanjani, founding families of the Islamic Republic of Iran, to speak out publicly and help calm the unrest. Both founding families refused to do so. This week, the Wall Street Journal carried an article with the following attention-grabbing headline: Iran's Islamic leaders face a crisis of faith as protests swell. The thrust of this article is that Iranians are becoming more secular, more anti-religious, and more anti-clerical. With respect to the last point, you can find plenty of videos online that show young Iranians running behind members of the clergy and slapping their turbans off their heads. Back in October, just a couple of weeks after the protests started, I produced an episode with Dr. Naghmeh Sohrabi in which we talked about the Iranians of the 1979 revolution. I asked her, was it an Islamic revolution? She answered no, it was not. And that answer comports with my own childhood memory of the revolution, which I also shared in the opening remarks of that episode. But here's the thing. If Iran's 1979 revolution was not an Islamic revolution, then why did Iranians vote just 2 months after the revolution to transform Iran into an Islamic republic? And then 8 months later, in a second referendum, they voted to approve a theocratic constitution. According to a prior guest of this program, Dr. Janet Afari, Iran's society has significantly changed since 1979. So much so that it is simply ridiculous for Iran's current octogenarian leaders to insist on the hijab and other supposedly Islamic precepts and policies. My guest for this episode, Dr. Behrooz Ghamari-Tabrizi of Princeton University, offers yet another explanation, which I won't spoil for you here before we get into it. He also talks about America's involvement in Iran, from the 1953 CIA coup d'etat to the 1979 hostage crisis. I asked him, did President Carter want to remove the Shah to perhaps replace him with a less ambitious leader? That question and others like it are so important as we are stuck in this intractable state of perpetual conflict with Iran, and as Iran every so often accuses the US of interfering in its internal affairs, such as the case of this week. After the passage of a US-backed resolution, Iran was removed from the remainder of its 4-year term from the Commission on the Status of Women, which is a United Nations women's rights agency. It's the first time that a country has been kicked out of such a commission. No doubt, Iran accused the US of interfering in its domestic affairs. Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi is a professor and chair of the Department of Near East Studies at Princeton University, where he is also the director of the Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. He has written extensively on the topics of Iran, the Iranian Revolution, social theory, and Islamist political thought in different journals and book chapters. Currently, he's working on a project on Mystical Modernity, a comparative study of philosophy of history and political theory of Walter Benjamin and Ali Shariati. He's the author of 3 books on different aspects and historical context of the 1979 Iranian Revolution and its aftermath. Here are their titles: Islam and Dissent in Post-Revolutionary Iran. Another book is Foucault in Iran, Islamic Revolution After the Entitlement, and his 3rd book is titled Remembering Akbar, Inside the Iranian Revolution. To learn more about Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi, you can visit his academic homepage, the link for which is provided in the detailed caption of this episode. And while you're there, click the link to a revolutionary song by Iranian women. They sing about hope. They sing that we're all in this together, so don't be afraid. They sing for the freedom to sing, dance, and kiss in the streets. I'm not interpreting here, I'm literally translating. They use the word laughter. They use the word happiness. It's an amazing song that I also discuss with Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi. By the way, please distribute this song to your friends and relatives and let them hear the voices of the Iranian women. Stay with me as Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi and I peel the history behind this news. Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi, it is a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me.
Thank you so much.
Let's begin with what I think was a transformative event in Iran's modern history, the 1953 coup d'etat. Could you please briefly tell us about this history?
Yeah. The 1953 coup in Iran is actually a transformative moment in the global history.
Oh, in global history. Okay.
I truly believe that because, first, the coup in Iran was the very first CIA covert operation. The very first.
Interesting.
And and this is the time that that's the beginning of the Cold War, and the U.S., the British, the Soviets are still trying to sort of define the terms of this kind of Cold War. What does it mean?
Yeah.
And they're trying to establish a certain kind of proxies for themselves to fight this Cold War. Of course, a lot of people like myself argue that the Cold War is such a misnomer.
It is? Why do you say that?
Cold War was a very hot war. It was Cold War because it didn't happen on European soil.
Ah, interesting. That's why they call it cold. It happened in the rest of the world.
It happens in the rest of the world, and there are varied estimates that during the Cold War from 1945-46 to the collapse of the Soviet Union, somewhere between 25 to 30 million people were killed.
Wow.
In proxy wars, right?
That begins to compete with World War II.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
More competing with World War I, but because World War II, the casualties were much higher.
Okay.
But nevertheless, when I say that this is sort of a misnomer, a Cold War, as if people are fighting over discourses and over different kinds of governmentalities and this and that. But no, there was actual war going on. But since the field of war was moved to outside Europe, it became known as the Cold War.
So the term Cold War is very much a Eurocentric, North American-centric sort of term.
Absolutely.
I see.
So the coup in Iran in 1953 had two elements. One element, that's why I said that it's a global significance. One element was the basically shifting of global authority of Western empires. That's the collapse of the British Empire. And the US, little by little, is stepping into the footprints of British Empire.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of confusion about the role of the American government after the Second World War, because many people, even like including Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, they looked up to Americans as an ally because they thought that the old empire is collapsed and a new sort of democratic force is merging in the world. And
that's true. Ho Chi Minh actually even worked with American military forces.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Because the Americans positioned themselves as the liberators, not only from fascism, but also from the old colonial powers. The two major ones, the British colonial empire and the French colonial empire. So in Vietnam, the French, and in the Middle East, the British mostly, also French. So Iranian case was very curious case because Mossadegh wanted to nationalize
Mossadegh being the Iranian prime minister.
The Iranian prime minister wanted to nationalize the oil industry because the oil industry, I mean, you'll be surprised to know that the profits of oil industry in Iran, which was controlled by the British Petroleum controlled the Iranian industry, was 80 to 20. 80% of the profit went to the British, 20% went to the Iranian side.
Wait, say that again, 80 to 20. How does that even make sense? Well, this is the national sort of wealth.
It didn't make any sense. And basically, the Iranian side wanted to renegotiate this kind of very colonial contract.
Heck yeah.
And obviously, I mean, the argument that would be reasonable for any reasonable person. That this is our resource. This is the oil is under our soil, and you are helping us to dig it out. But it's unfair to have only 20%, and that 20%, by the way, included paying for the expenses of maintenance of the refineries and all that.
So it's not a 20% net, it's 20% gross. Now they still have to pay. Oh, wow. Okay.
And so Mossadegh nationalized the oil. And of course, oil becomes such a key commodity after the war, even before the war, but with the rising industrialization around the world, oil is a key element of this force of industrialization around the world. And the British could not basically accept this idea of nationalizing the Iranian oil industry. And there are a lot of details about this, but Dr.
Ghamari-Tabrizi, you keep on saying the British. I thought the 1953 coup was orchestrated, and I'm jumping ahead here, by the U.S. What am I missing here?
I mean, that's the point. I sort of in my introduction, I said that the U.S. had a very kind of a strange position at that time. That Mossadegh himself, the Iranian prime minister, actually looked up to the Americans and asked them to help him to nationalize the oil industry.
Boy. Okay.
And the U.S., there was a conversation in the U.S. and the Truman administration and the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower suddenly shifted the American position to a more hawkish interventionist kind of position. And the British were basically constantly on the Americans' case that if Iran nationalizes the oil and Mossadegh, who was a liberal person, controls the political
Not a
system,
communist.
Not a communist at all. I mean, he was actually pretty anti-communist.
Okay, good. So that's clarified.
I don't know whether it was good or not, but
no. I'm just looking at the geopolitics. So they weren't looking at Iran
absolutely.
turning communist all of a sudden. Okay, so that's not the case.
But this is what, and the British basically shifted the conversation about oil to containing the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And arguing that Iranian liberal administration will be incapable of containing this expansion of Soviet influence towards the Persian Gulf and the oil industry.
And back then, the Soviet Union actually bordered Iran. Russia doesn't border Iran anymore, right? In the 1950s, the Soviet Union.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And so it was once the British changed the frame of the conversation and put it in those Cold War-ish frame, then the U.S., the Americans became very, very involved and interested in toppling Mossadegh's administration. It was about the oil, but at the same time, it was about containing the Soviet Union. And in their mind, in the Americans' mind, who bought into the British kind of propaganda, Mossadegh, the Iranian prime minister, could not be a force that the Western powers could rely on in order to contain the Soviet Union. So,
so the U.S. topples. There's a CIA operation called Operation Ajax, and we won't get into the details. It's history. the U.S. Topples Mossadegh, and there's I think, a 4 or 5 day period in which the Shah actually flees to Italy and then comes back. So how relevant was the experience and the memory of the 1953 coup in Iran's 1979 revolution? And if I may, please, I'll introduce my own personal perspective here, Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi. I vividly recall my father telling me during the 1979 revolution, I was just a little boy, he was telling me about his own participation in the pro-Mossadegh demonstrations in the 1950s. So that's my little corner of the world. Yes. But was this pervasive, prevalent, this sort of memory?
Oh, it was very, very pervasive. I mean, I grew up in the late 1960s, 1970s in Iran. And if you ask any primary school kid, what happened during Mossadegh, they would say that the CIA toppled Mossadegh. Like it was just given, and that's why when during the Clinton administration, a lot of these documents were declassified about the role of the CIA in the coup in Iran. It was no news in Iran, like
we already knew this.
Wow, this is not a revelation. We already knew this. Everybody knew this. And so, it left. I'm sorry, but it left a very, very deep mark on Iranian psyche that denied the Shah's monarchy legitimacy, and that stain remained with the Shah. Of course, he came to power 12 years before that coup, right? Mm-hmm. And for the rest of the 25 years, that he became the American stooge. He was American puppet, because it's so hard to shed that kind of perception.
Yeah.
If the Dulles brothers and the Kermit Roosevelt and the CIA, they bring you back from Rome to put you on the throne again, so that really...
And the Dulles brothers were, remind me please, the U.S. Secretary of State under Eisenhower and head of CIA?
Director of CIA, yeah.
So...
And as I'm sitting here speaking to you at the Princeton University, right across me, there is a Princeton library that all the Dulles papers are there. So
I should come and visit.
It's right across the street,
Let's fast forward a little bit, a few months in the 1979 revolution. Did the Islamist students' takeover of the U.S. embassy in Tehran have anything to do with the 1953 coup? I don't know, was it a sort of used as an excuse, or what was the narrative there?
The fear after the revolution was, and I would say, was a real fear. It wasn't kind of paranoia, because sometimes people say, oh, Iranians are paranoid, and it reminds me of, when the declassified CIA document about Cuba, and this CIA officer said that Fidel Castro was very paranoid because he constantly thought that the CIA was trying to kill him. I said, well, the CIA was trying to kill him. Indeed, 19 times they tried to assassinate him. So if you
what's the Iranian fear?
Iranian fear was that, the U.S. is going to mount a counter-revolutionary coup. And they experienced it before, and the U.S. had a lot of invested interest in Iran. Iran had the 5th largest military in the world during the revolution.
Wow. And I assume most of that was U.S. and perhaps some European.
Most of it, like 80% of it, was U.S. Military hardware and arms. So not only the U.S. was the main beneficiary of Iranian oil industry, but also Iran was the #1 client of American military industrial complex.
Wow.
and Saudis now have taken up that role,
Yeah.
But at that time, Iran had the 5th largest military in the world, and it was hard to believe at the time, and I include myself in that crowd,
Yeah.
It was hard to believe during that time that the U.S. is going to sit back and not do anything, right?
Wow.
And so there was one attempt to occupy American embassy a few weeks after the revolution, and that
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yes, it was this leftist communist urban guerrilla group called Sazman Fadayan Khalq.
Is that MEK or?
No, MEK was Mujahideen. These are Mujahideen were Islamist. This was the Fadayan were this guerrilla urban guerrilla group organization. And they actually tried to they did go inside the embassy, and Khomeini and people around Khomeini immediately ordered them to leave the embassy, and they didn't want to sort of antagonize the US. But there was a kind of there was also, I think, the left hopefully we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the left didn't have that much of an organizational power, but the left had a lot of discursive power.
Discursive
and there was
power.
Competition with the ruling state, Islamist state, to show which one is more anti-imperialist. Because the left always thought that, the communist left thought that they are the sort of the flag bearers of anti-imperialist.
Like the paladin, the vanguard of anti-imperialism,
I
see.
And then, the Islamists also wanted to prove that they also are as anti-imperial, and if not more anti-imperialist than the Iranian left. So when the students took over American embassy, we're jumping a little bit ahead, but I'm going to finish this story and
please
track back a little bit, first of all, they wanted to show that they are as anti-imperialist as anybody in the political landscape in Iran. And many of these students, I knew them. At the time, I was a student at the Polytechnic University in Tehran, and most of the members of the leadership of that students who took over the embassy came from Polytechnic University. So I knew them pretty well. And then, they thought that they're going to go inside the embassy and disrupt any attempt that the Americans are planning for a counter-revolutionary coup. It was an attempt for disruption rather than hostage-taking.
Wow, okay.
So they go inside, and this is one of those, mysteries of history, like they go inside and they see that they are basically throwing in tons and tons of documents into these giant shredding machines.
Yeah, and shredders weren't all that available in those days. Now every home has a shredder, so that was
but these are like industrial scale.
Yeah.
And you wonder that. So why didn't they shred these documents
before,
knowing that there's a revolution going on? They're just constantly,
especially since there was an earlier attempt.
Right?
Yeah. Interesting. Huh.
So then it became a curiosity that so what are these documents? They said that we're going to put together these shredded documents, and day after day, suddenly 2-3 weeks later, they realized that oops, we are inside the American embassy with all the embassy employees, and we have created a worldwide crisis,
Wow, interesting. And then Mr. Khomeini never ordered them to leave. Let's follow up this conversation in the next segment. We'll be back after a short break to talk about foreign influence in Iran's 1979 revolution. At the start of these protests in Iran, I asked Dr. Sohrabi, is it a revolution? The answer to this simple question turned out to be rather complex. There's a point after which people's persistent protests turn into a revolution, and they then collectively recognize that it is a revolution. And I reckon Iranians have passed that point, that we do have a revolution in Iran now. Since this revolution started with the murder of Ms. Mahsa Amini and has been inspired by women, Dr. Sohrabi told me just an incredible story. It's of an Iranian woman who rode her motorcycle in the dead of night in the 1970s to distribute revolutionary materials. My conversation with her is the story of the Iranians of the 1979 revolution. Ms. Mahsa Amini was arrested and later killed because she allegedly didn't properly wear her hijab. And the hijab has become a symbol, almost a pillar of this so-called Islamic regime in Iran. But here's the irony. The hijab did not even come from Islam. Not at all. Dr. Afari explains the history of hijab. The hijab is Persian and perhaps also Byzantine, the two superpowers of the world at the time Islam came onto the scene. In Persia, that is, the Sasanian Persian Empire, the hijab belonged to the upper classes. In fact, as late as the late 1800s, lower class women, including prostitutes, were prevented from wearing the hijab. Dr. Afari tells a fascinating story of the Iranian women, and she enters the bedrooms of Iranian families, marriage, abortion, and sexual politics. Finally, I have a question for you. Why are Iran and America in a perpetual state of hostilities? This question becomes really interesting when we think of it in the context of the Vietnam War. Even though we fought the North Vietnamese in open warfare and suffered more than 50,000 casualties, after some years we re-established relations with Vietnam. But after the 1979 hostage crisis, which was 43 years ago, we have yet to establish relations with Iran. We don't even talk to them directly. One of my guests, Dr. Vali Nasser, provides a very interesting answer to this question, one that may surprise you. The links to my conversations with Dr. Sohrabi, Afari, and Nasser are provided in the detailed caption of this episode. Now, let's get back to our conversation with Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi. Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi, many Iranians believe and allege that the U.S. in fact wanted to remove the Shah to perhaps replace him with a less ambitious leader in Iran. How much of this, if any of it, is credible?
I don't give much credibility to that narrative. I think this is...
You don't, okay.
This is a revisionist history that puts so much emphasis on Carter administration's decisions and forgets the that kind of revisionism forgets the all-out power of this revolutionary movement, and frankly the impossibility of containing it. I think the U.S. at some point realizes that this is a losing battle. I think that's true. But the U.S. realizes that meaning saving the Shah was a losing battle.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And but that realization, I think, comes just a few weeks before the final victory of the revolution.
Oh, wow, way late.
Very late. And this happens when Jimmy Carter sends General Heuser to Tehran. And then in Guadeloupe, they have a meeting with the French, the Germans, and to decide what to do. And at that point, this is January of 1979.
Was that a month before sort of the culmination
before
of...
yeah.
Wow, okay.
I mean, at that point, it was foregone conclusion that the Shah could not withstand the force of this revolutionary movement.
Uh-huh.
And the U.S. basically, their Carter policy and the state, there were a lot of, I mean, we can't go into details of the differences in the State Department and the Defense Department. All those things were true, but the bottom line for the Americans was that how to limit the damage. And the damage that was going to be inflicted on the U.S. interest in Iran was one, the integrity of the Iranian military.
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned earlier, fifth largest military in the world, number one client of American arms, and two, the flow of oil. Because American, they have already experienced this kind of oil crisis in the U.S., and they thought that they can.
Yeah, 1973, right? The Arab embargo.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And they thought that they can withstand another oil crisis like that. And so in Guadalupe, they decided to open a channel to Khomeini. And that channel to Khomeini, actually, the declassified documents came out a couple of years ago. That in those documents, it clearly shows that the direct contact between the U.S. and Khomeini in Paris had basically two items. And Khomeini guaranteed in their conversation that they are not going to dissolve the Iranian military, and the flow of oil would continue to Western powers. And Khomeini guaranteed it. And it's only at that point that they realized that, okay, they can basically rest assured that if Shah leaves Iran, then their two main concerns would be met by the new government. Right?
Did General Heiser ever tell the Iranian military to stand down? I hate asking that question. It just makes the Iranians sound like they have no agency in what they do, their own destiny. But let me just go back to the question. So, was there any sort of mandate for General Heiser to say to suggest to the Iranian generals stand down?
Yeah, I mean, Heiser's mandate was to make sure that the military remains intact.
Okay.
At the time that he goes to Iran, there is martial law in Iran, and the martial law pretty much in practice is violated and had become meaningless because people constantly are breaking the martial law. Martial law was that you can't have congregations of 3 or more people at any given time. Hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating.
So it was a martial law without any enforcement, without any teeth.
And of course, his assessment, it is true that he thought that the military has shown that it's not capable of preventing these protests, these rallies, these demonstrations. And it's basically, if they open fire, I mean, that's basically the $64,000 question. Right. What would you do if suddenly 200,000 people are marching? I mean, there are marches of 2 million people.
Yeah.
But if like 100,000, 150,000 people are marching, what would the military do? Are they going to shoot them? They tried it once, right? In September of 1978, they tried it, the very first day of martial law. And it was a disaster. And on that day, we signed off their own demise because, no regime can survive if in one day you kill hundreds of people. It's hard, at least, and of course, at the time, the rumor was that, 4,000, 10,000 people were killed. And it turned out that, it was like around 70 people who were killed.
Yeah.
But who cares for reality? If there is a revolutionary movement and there is a rumor that 10,000 people were killed, people would operationalize that 10,000 number.
You need the power of propaganda for the revolution, right?
That's propaganda.
We're talking about Heiser or President Carter. It takes me to two narratives about the last days of the Shah that just fascinate me. Mm-hmm. First, that the Shah was chronically paralyzed by indecisiveness and sort of flip-flopping in his policies. And second, and somewhat I guess, I haven't lived in Iran for decades. I was there as a boy. It's embarrassing for me to even say this, that the king of Iran so greatly just was consumed with what the West thinks about him or the tumults in Iran. Before we go to these narratives, are these historically correct? What those two narratives that I share with you?
I think so, yes.
Okay.
And the Shah, the last 4 years, 3 to 4 years of the Shah was a changed man.
In what sense?
He had different kinds of ambitions in mind. And I don't think that those ambitions were necessarily anything that the Western powers would say, okay, we have to stop him. Because that narrative that they say, oh, the US wanted to remove the Shah.
Yeah, okay.
I don't think it wasn't the kind of ambition that would worry the Western powers, But, with changing the Iranian calendar, Islamic calendar to a monarchical calendar,
so Iran's calendars suddenly became from like 1400 years or something, went to 2500 years.
2500
from
years.
The coronation of Cyrus the Great.
Cyrus,
okay,
right.
okay.
And that's sort of the change in his personality starts from those celebrations of 2500 years of monarchy and Persian Empire. So the idea of Persian Empire, this is kind of, I think he was getting into that kind of mode of reviving Persian Empire. In his mind, he had a mission to reinvent the glory of Persian Empire. And that Persian Empire, again, was not necessarily something anti-West or something that would basically undermine Americans' interest in the region. It was something that could coexist with American interest in the region. So I don't think the U.S. was so worried about this ambition because, okay, let him have that ambition so long as he buys his military arms,
his weapons from us,
and he gives oil, that's fine, But at the same time, I wanted to also say this, that during the revolutionary movement, the last year of his rule, as we know, and later we found out that he was suffering from cancer. And at some point, I think he realized that his cancer is terminal. Then, the situation changed, and he became very indecisive. He became very erratic. He became so worried about his legacy because he was facing death. And in that context, on the one hand, he was blaming the Americans. On the other hand, he constantly was in touch with the American embassy to ask for guidance,
I want to just interrupt you, if I may, please. That last comment that you made, calling the American embassy for guidance. Iran was full of generals and diplomats and statesmen.
Right.
Was he leaning more towards foreign counsel, or is that just something that we've picked up in history?
No, I think that's a sign of his confusion. I think he's relying on his advisors, and his advisors also are relying on the advice of Americans. I think it becomes very hard to sort of draw a line between local agents and foreign agents.
Yeah,
because all the local agents are trained by the foreign agents.
Interesting.
And they are friends. They went to the same military school together. They know each other's families, and so it's hard to sort of make that kind of distinction, which I know that a lot of these revisionist narratives make that kind of distinction between local agents, and those local agents are military generals and the heads of Iranian security, Savak, and all those, and then foreign advisors. And these are kind of, I think we need to look at them as in a continuum rather than two sides of sources of advice.
Interesting. You talked about the last 4 or 5 years, or perhaps the last decade of the Shah's reign in the 1970s. One thing that I remember as a child, I didn't appreciate it then. Now I do. I remember, maybe it's a small point, but please help me along here. I remember many streets in Iran were named Eisenhower, Kennedy. Those are the only two I remember.
And Roosevelt, yeah.
And Roosevelt. There you go. Yes. I'm sure those names are not there anymore. But is that something that came from the Shah, named this street? I mean, you don't see streets named, Emmanuel Macron here in Washington, D.C. or anything like that. Is that something that came from the Shah, or why would that be?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether the Shah directly was involved in naming these streets, but that was the air, that was in the air, like the Tehran municipality, Tehran mayor. These are all people who come from the same kind of hierarchy, and it was given that in so many different ways they needed to show their allegiances, their commitments to a certain kind of direction in history, a certain kind of political ideology, and these are the ways that they show it. The main east-west street in Tehran was called Eisenhower, and a very sort of affluent neighborhood in Tehran, Roosevelt, and then there was a possibly the first highway that went through Tehran was called Kennedy, and Kennedy Square was a sort of a major sort of hub of hanging out and all that, but these are kind of these are symbolic, of course, and it's a constant reminder, like the way we think about Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, that how nations create this kind of memory of themselves, and through museums, through buildings, from stamps, from
there are probably also signs that show that in the Cold War, and I'm using quotation marks for that after learning from you the misnomer here, in the Cold War world, we lean more to the U.S. by even here are the names of our streets that are after American presidents. We'll be back after a short break to talk about the revolution's immediate aftermath.
We hope you are enjoying this podcast. And if you are, then why not treat us to a cup of coffee? That's right. For the price of a cup of coffee, you too can become a monthly supporter of the History Behind News podcast. We rely on your support to continue this program, to continue peeling the history behind our news. Supporting us is easy. Just click the support link in the detailed caption of this episode. And while you're there, check out the information about our guests and other attributions and links. And thank you.
Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi, I often hear that Iran's 1979 revolution was not an Islamic revolution. And I happen to agree with it, no doubt, because of my own limited experience and sort of fading memory of that time. But how do we reconcile this with the results of a 1979 referendum in which an overwhelming majority of Iranians did, in fact, vote to transform Iran into an Islamic republic?
Right. I mean, in my own work, I go back and forth between calling Iranian Revolution Islamic Revolution or Iranian Revolution or the Revolution of 1979, because sometimes I don't want to get involved in this kind of semantics of it. Yeah. But I think in its spirit, this was an Islamic revolution. Islamic, not in the sense that it's very unfortunate that in post-revolutionary, after 1979, we have the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. And then that Islamic fundamentalism is projected back to the Iranian Revolution as the point of origin of it. While that kind of political Islam that was operating during the Islamic Revolution in Iran was fundamentally different from that kind of Islamic fundamentalism that emerges primarily through the Afghan Mujahideen fighting the Soviets and so on and so forth. But it's very important, the way I use Islamic Revolution, I have in mind something like Catholic liberation theology rather than Islamic Christian fundamentalism. They had a
you lost me there. I don't follow you. Catholic liberation theology.
Liberation theology, like in Nicaragua, in El Salvador. Like these are sort of revolutionary, emancipatory kind of ways of thinking about religion, and saying that, they're moving away from those old sort of structures of religion, very hierarchical, very rigid, very kind of patriarchal, very all these things that they want to, it comes from Central America and Latin America, to say that, religion at its core is a worldview about justice and emancipation. And
that's a profound statement. Okay.
That's the kind of Islamic ideology that led the Iranian Revolution. And that ideology was very much informed by liberation struggles around the world. Iranian Revolution was much more influenced by Algerian Revolution, Frantz Fanon, from Aimé Césaire, and Ali Shariati, who was one of their interlocutors. Than anything that we hear about, like Osama bin Laden and
of course,
So this is a very different kind of trajectory and different kinds of appropriation of religion into political discourse.
So when Iranians voted in 1979 in the referendum to turn Iran into an Islamic republic, let me run with this and tell me if I'm getting this correctly. Did they have in mind an idea of an Islam that's sort of liberating, anti-imperialist? I want to venture to say that they didn't have in mind, perhaps a majority of them, of turbans on TV all day long.
No.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
And not only, this is the interesting part. Not only didn't Iranian people had no idea when they were voting Islamic Republic, the leaders themselves didn't have any idea.
What do you mean by that?
Khomeini didn't have any idea what exactly was an Islamic Republic, because it was a neologism, right? This is like, people say that, why didn't we read Khomeini's Velayat Faqih, his book on Islamic governance? Okay, you could read his book. Nothing would have changed having read his book.
Because, why do you say, would you not know more about his ideology had you read his book?
Well, because it was very ambiguous. And that ambiguity operated to a certain degree at all levels, at levels of people on the street and at the level of leaders of the revolution. When Khomeini was kicked out of, Khomeini was in exile in Iraq for more than a decade.
In the city of Najaf, which is a Shia sort of...
And the Shah basically pushed Iraqis to kick Khomeini out. Perhaps strategically, the worst mistake of
that was a mistake. He went to France and he had more freedom all of a sudden.
So, suddenly he's at the center of the global media at the time. Instead of sitting in Najaf and talking to XYZ, he's sitting in Paris talking to Mark Wallace and Peter Jennings
and BBC.
Wow. So, but there, I always say that one point that people forget, that it's only in Paris that Khomeini says, up to that point, he said that the revolution was Istiqlal, Azadi, Hukumat Islami, independence, freedom, and Islamic rule, right? In Paris, he said that, no, this is Istiqlal, Azadi, Jumhuri Islami, Islamic Republic, right?
So independence, freedom, and a republic.
And a republic. And actually, the first interview he gave with the Le Monde reporter, and the Le Monde reporter actually asked him, what do you mean by republic? And Khomeini said, like all other republics, like, don't you have a republic here? We will have a republic, you know. So republicanism...
That sounds so benign.
But republicanism is a neologism, right? I mean, for his political philosophy. I mean, we don't have republicanism because it generates a fundamental contradiction, because republicanism is about the source of legitimacy, which is it's the constituents. This is the people.
Yeah.
And Islam, the source of legitimacy is the divine, you know. And how do you bring these two together? And when I said that this is such an ambiguous thing, and over and over again, Khomeini talks about the significance of sovereignty of people in determining their own destiny. You know?
That sounds so good, doesn't it?
No, of course. I mean, why then so many millions of people were following him? Because he was saying all the right things.
I know. Yeah.
And of course, people say that we were all duped, right? and Khomeini knew what I don't think Khomeini was trying to dupe anybody. If he was trying to dupe anybody, he himself was included in that crowd. He was duped because.
So, are you saying that he has certain ideology? Then he goes to Paris, and you know, I'm not trying to follow a chronology. Forget that part. Yeah. What I'm saying is, he was sort of kind of figuring it out, weaving it together as he was going through.
Absolutely.
This was such a colossal. Event that he was also trying to put together.
Yes. Let me just say a word here, because you said it so nicely, and I think the difference between my own scholarship and others, many others, I mean, there are so many, I respect their scholarship, is that I don't think that Khomeini had a blueprint and was planning how to implement that blueprint. Khomeini was shaped. His ideas was shaped by the way the events were unfolding. And he was trying to make sense of all these events and come up with solutions as things happened around him. So it's a much more contingent kind of history, the way I see it. And therefore, I disagree with people who said that, oh, he was duped. He was duping people. You know, we were not duped, you know, because he was trying to figure out himself, you know.
I see from that respect. You know, but what you're saying is not all that unusual if you read the history of the Russian, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, or going further back, the French Revolution. They just navigated through the events. And I'm not saying this to sort of support Mr. Khomeini or anything like that. It's just history.
That's right.
And one of the things that I wanted to discuss with you, as you brought up religion and how Iran's fundamentalist version of religion was fundamentally different than how the revolution started, is there's one figure in particular, Grand Ayatollah Shariat Madari, and I know him. I know of him because he was popular particularly in Northwest Iran, the Azeri, Turkish-speaking people, including my own parents. And he was not in the Khomeini camp. He reluctantly becomes part of Khomeini's camp and is eventually silenced. This is just a fascinating story, how he was one of the really highly respected Shia clerics in the world, and he's put aside.
Yeah. Actually, I mean, Ayatollah Shariat Madari was perhaps the most important figure who basically saved Khomeini's life
What do you
when
mean?
he was arrested in 1964. In 1964, Khomeini was arrested because of his anti-white revolution, anti-Shah sermons.
Oh, the Shah's white revolution. Okay.
White revolution.
Uh-huh.
And Shariat Madari really advocated on his behalf. And instead of jail time, they exiled Khomeini to Iraq, you know. So
wow.
Yeah. But Khomeini, you know, that's also another kind of misunderstanding of Khomeini's position. When I said that it was not like an Islamic fundamentalism, Khomeini was extremely marginal in the Iranian seminaries. He was not a well-respected jurist or theologian, and the great majority of significant ayatollahs, or what they call the sources of emulation, despised Khomeini because for centuries, the dominant political philosophy inside seminaries was the advocacy of political quietism. They didn't want to be involved in politics at all. And Khomeini actually is a aberration of that kind of philosophy. And he was not really influential. He was extremely influential in younger generation of seminary students for political reasons, but extremely marginalized in the great establishment of Shi'i seminaries. But when he comes back to Iran, then none of those sources of emulation or grand ayatollahs have any kind of standing or political capital to stand against him, you know, because he has a whole nation behind him, you know.
Oh, interesting.
And so Khomeini was in so many different ways an exceptional character. He did not, and I want to sort of underline the not part, he did not represent the position of the Shi'i seminaries. He was an aberration, and he taught classes that nobody would dare to teach when he was in the seminary. There's a famous, such as, I mean, like on philosophy, for example, or in mysticism. Khomeini was a great mystic, and he taught seminars in mysticism, and Shi'is were always very, very skeptical of mysticism, you know.
Interesting.
And if you, a little anecdote would help here.
Please.
That when Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, Khomeini sent a letter to Gorbachev. By the way, via this very interesting woman who was one of his inner circles. And
Gorbachev's inner circles?
No, in Khomeini's inner
circles. Okay.
And then in that letter, Khomeini says that, you know, I know that you want to change the situation in Soviet Union and you're looking for alternatives. Why don't you look into Islam as an alternative?
Seriously?
Yeah. It's okay. I mean, if you had time, you know, just search this letter, you know. And he said, you're looking for an alternative. Why don't you look at Islam as an alternative? Send some of your philosophers and scientists to Qom, and we'll show you what we can offer. And then he names a series of key figures in Islamic history, in philosophy. And those characters are interesting because, like, he names Ibn Arabi, who was a sort of very out there mystic, that if you say his name in front of any Sunni or Shia sources of, you know, Shia sources of emulation or Sunni imams, they would run scared, you know. I say, okay, we don't want to touch that guy, you know. And then he says, like, Avicenna, who was a rationalist philosopher of 11th century, and then Al-Ghazali, who was a mystical philosopher, and it's like a mishmash of different kinds of schools of thought in Islamic history. And then you wonder that, what is this guy thinking? You know, like, first of all, writing to Gorbachev. Second of all, presenting a very kind of a bizarre history of Islamic philosophy that no one in Qom seminary or any other seminary would touch this list as the representative of Islamic philosophy.
I gotta ask this, Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi. Did Gorbachev ever respond?
No.
All right. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi as we get into the perspective.
The History Behind News podcast is available on all your favorite podcast platforms. Of course, we love your reviews and ratings of our podcast, especially on Apple and Spotify. And remember, don't keep us to yourself. Tell a friend about the History Behind News podcast.
Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi, has the creation and the 40-plus year duration of the Islamic regime in Iran ironically turned Iranians against religion?
That's a very hard question to answer. I would say it has created new forms of religiosity and also anti-religion sentiments. I say new forms of religiosity because, there was a paradox in the Iranian constitution, the Islamic Republic constitution, that, it's when you read it, it said that, everyone is free to express his or her ideas unless it contradicts the basic creeds of Islam,
Freedom within limits.
But then that created a problem. Who determines what the creeds of Islam is, right? Because Islam is like, there's so many different possibilities.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that little thing that was a kind of a benign restriction on freedoms became a point of contention since the time of revolution to the present time, right? Because in their mind, when they were drafting the constitution, they wanted to write an Islamic constitution to say that, okay, this is Islamic constitution. And indeed, when they were writing it, this is in 1979, 1980, many ayatollahs would say that, what are we doing? We don't know how to write a constitution. Who are we to write a constitution?
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
These are like in the minutes are, in the archives. You can look at these minutes.
Wow. That is
And
fascinating.
then there's a very interesting exchange between the vice chair of the assembly, Constitutional Assembly, and this ayatollah. And,
so this is just like few months after the revolution.
This is like 6 months after the revolution. 6 months after the revolution.
Okay.
And it goes back to the conversation we were having earlier that no one has a clue. What are they doing?
Yeah.
And then the vice chair of the assembly, Ayatollah Beheshti, who was a very, very key figure in post-revolutionary polity, who was assassinated in 1981. He says that, well, you ask these questions that we don't know what we are doing because you don't do your homework. Because we gave you the constitution of China, we gave you the constitution of Bulgaria, and we told you wherever you see Marxism, change it to Islam, and then you have a constitution.
Oh my gosh! I feel rude asking this question, but I'll ask it. Is this for real?
Yeah, of course it's for real.
Oh, wow.
I've documented. Grab a copy of my first book, and it's all there. And then,
so first of all, Bulgaria and China, they have ideological constitutions.
We are another ideological state, and we follow the model of other ideological states, And
wow.
Just change Marxism to Islam, we have an Islamic constitution. What's the big deal? And then then the Islam. Who defines Islam there? Is this Ayatollah Shariat Madari or Ayatollah Khomeini?
Yeah.
Is this Ayatollah Beheshti or XYZ? And then you see that in the first 10, 15 years after the revolution, this incredible let the 1,000 flowers bloom kind of situation that everyone lays a claim on, I am defining what Islam is. There are all these lay intellectuals, there are lawyers, there are journalists, there everyone says that my interpretation of Islam is this, and I act according to my interpretation. So Islam, from the point of reference, becomes a point of contention.
Oh, wow, interesting.
And that's why I say that it generated new forms of religiosity. And I don't think that a great majority, I mean, again, this is, I have not done a survey. I'm not, I don't know the numbers.
Yeah.
But my sense from looking at the history of how these ideas unfolded in society, I would say that it's not the fact that Iranians are becoming anti-religion. They're subscribed to different forms of religiosity, and that different forms of religiosity involves Sufi groups, and there are amazing books about this. Sufism became very popular in Iran. Poetry, mystical poetry reading groups became very popular in Iran. So, of course, this is not what we have in mind when we think about religion, but these are different kinds of religious communism. This is one can say that this is different forms of spirituality that continues to actually exist and in different circles grow.
Maybe anti-state religion.
It's totally anti-state religion. Totally
Yeah.
anti-state religion.
Let me ask another difficult question from you, and I promise it's the last one in our.
But you told me that you're going to ask me easy questions. Now you're asking all hard questions. But
No. After you gave the this superb answer to the last question, I realized my next question may be just as difficult. Has this Islamic regime changed Iran's culture? And I asked this question in the context of the word happiness. Let me explain. I shared a song with you, a recent revolution. I emailed it to you. And in that song, they literally talk about the word laughter, desire for dancing, kissing, laughter are in that song. This is really profound and in a way sad that they really are asking for that. Now, if you compare it with revolutionary songs from 1979, they talk about martyrdom, they talk about the revolutionary struggle and Allah and all of that.
That's right.
So has Iran's culture somewhat changed that people, I don't know, for their prophets no longer want to mourn their deaths. They now want to celebrate birthdays.
Mm-hmm. I think the revolution and 4 decades after the revolution has transformed Iranian society in so many different ways. One important way that it has changed Iranian culture is the way people understand themselves. I would call that, the creation of a hope-bearing conscious subject.
Hope-bearing conscious subject.
I mean, people always say that, see how the situation is so terrible in Iran that there are constantly protests. And I always say that, well, look at it from the other side. Look what an amazing society this is, that people are so conscious of who they are and what they want, and they constantly assert themselves. It's not the case, I mean, it depends on from which side you're looking,
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the Iranian government is basically so horrible that is incomparable to other horrible governments around the world. There are so many. I mean, there's no competition there. There are a lot of horrible governments in the world.
Yeah.
But why is it that the Iranians are so up in arms, so to speak, to express what they want, to express who they are, to express what they need, to express that desire for life, to express that desire for well-being of themselves? So something has changed, and that goes back to your question, that have the revolution and the Islamic Republic transformed Iranians culturally? I say it transformed Iranians consciously. Their consciousness is a different kind of consciousness. And I think that, there's this great historian, E.P. Thompson, Marxist historian, British, who had this concept of moral economy. And he said that, when you think about bread riots, hunger existed in human history for always, as long as we know.
Yeah.
But most often, people starve to death before they go protest.
Yeah.
And what is that moment that people actually go and protest? And that protest requires so many elements to be in place.
Yeah.
One thing is that form of consciousness, that you are a subject, that you can step outside your home, you can step outside your individual domain to become part of a collective, to demand things that you desire, right?
So you're not saying this in defense of the regime, you're talking more about the people.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's actually, it's a critique of the regime.
Of course,
because Of course, and as I said, they are repressive, they're authoritarian, they kill people, they arrest people, they in most cases with really incredible savagery, but if that happens in other places, we don't see that often that people actually sustain their movements. We don't see that often that people actually get together in collective forms to produce this kind of arts, to produce those kind of songs. That it happens, but it's not that often. In Iran, it seems like now every 2-3 years we have a new kind of
protested, outburst,
expression of dissent,
Yeah.
And the Iranians, that expression of dissent is the most important cultural transformation, I believe, that has happened since the 1979 revolution. And I do believe that it's in genealogy, it goes back to that 1979 revolution. That once a nation, once a subject asserts itself and demands to be recognized and demands respect, then it's very, very hard to push that subject back into a box and say that, no, you do what I tell you to do. It doesn't happen. And this is what the Revolution 79 has done. And that's sort of, and again, it's a mystery of how that revolutionary culture is transferred generation after generation. This is like the third generation of post-revolutionary Iranians. But I think that's the important thing. We have the brutality of the regime, but the brutality of the regime does not explain the culture of dissent, because we have that brutality everywhere in the world. But we don't have that culture of dissent everywhere in the world.
That's very intriguing, very interesting. Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners.
So much. This was fun.
It was very fun. Thank you so much. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. The opinions and statements of our guests are their own. We neither agree nor disagree with them. We're only interested in the perspective they provide through history. At History Behind News, we're honored that our guests share their expertise with us, most of which are based on years of scholarship and research, and we provide links to their projects and publications for your benefit to review them if you wish. Otherwise, we're not affiliated with our guests. We just think they teach us pretty cool history, the history behind our news. Also, unless we explicitly inform you, we're not affiliated with any institutions, including Amazon, for which book links are shared here from time to time for your convenience. Finally, as a reminder, we don't do news here at History Behind News. We peel the news for the history behind it. And our mission is not to provide a complete account and analysis of the past, rather is to highlight some issues and incidents in our history that may poke and prod your discerning minds into seeking some perspective for our news. And if you disagree with our take on history, well then, it means we've succeeded in getting you to think about the history behind news. And of course, share your thoughts with me by leaving your comments on Twitter or sending an email to adele@historybehindnews.com. I love to hear from you. I love to learn from you. Until next time, this is Adele with History Behind News, a history podcast for our news.